Here's your news for July 1st, 2020. And your headlines for today include why WWE suspended 2 referees and a wrestler, WWE undergoing major changes thanks to the current global situation, AEW wrestler returns to Twitter explaining why he deleted his profile, Impact Wrestling makes major changes to Slammiversary main event, 2 more former released WWE stars tease appearances at Impact Slammiversary, new details of Velveteen Dream's car accident revealed, and more. We're kicking off today with news from NXT UK as following several claims of wrongdoing by several members of the Black and Gold brand, the company hosted a mandatory conference call this week as a reminder of company policy. The company also confirmed that referees Joel Allen and Chris Roberts had been released, whilst Joe Coffey has been suspended as well, and these actions follow on from last week's releases of El Ligero and Travis Banks. WWE COO Triple H made it clear in the call that there is a zero-tolerance policy in effect, providing there was irrefutable evidence to back up any claims. There was no discussion about any other changes to the UK brand, despite rumors of WWE closing it down, as it seems NXT UK will continue to tape its TV as soon as it's once again feasible to do so. There's been trouble for the WWE back in the States too, as the proposed live events outside of the Performance Center are officially off. Recently, it was reported that WWE had live shows for paying fans set up in Lakeland, Florida on July 24th and 27th, but according to Dave Meltzer on Wrestling Observer Radio, that won't be happening. He said, "So the dates July 24th and 27th were cancelled officially by WWE. The people who are going to work these shows got the word later in the afternoon. If they get delayed, nobody knows that's going on. Everything's spiked again. It's quite sad. It's quite sad. That's all I can say." Given that the number of cases in the US continues to rise, especially in Florida, it's not surprising that WWE canceled these shows, and now, once again, there is no sign of when things in wrestling will get back to normal. For now, the WWE will have to continue with its makeshift crowd in the Performance Center, but even this has caused issues for the company. Recently, the company faced backlash after it was revealed that the crowd weren't allowed to wear protective masks, and that Kevin Dunn used a loudspeaker to yell at those who were wearing masks. As this incident with Dunn took place prior to a positive test within the PC, as well as prior to the reported 24 positive cases in the company, the WWE has apparently changed its attitude. An internal email obtained by Fightful sent to the NXT superstars has made the new rules clear, as it reads, "As a reminder, wearing masks, sanitizing, and social distancing will be required at the Performance Center this week and going forward. You'll be required to wear a mask upon entering, and we ask that you adhere to these requirements in order to minimize risks." This is clearly a far cry from the company's previous no-mask stance, and it's also been reported that NXT superstars showed up early yesterday for a drive-thru test. Though these tests are very important, especially after so many WWE employees have tested positive, there's been concerns that the results of these tests won't come back until after the Great American Bash has been taped. As of right now, WWE superstars are being instructed not to reveal the results of any of their tests, and we'll make sure to provide updates as this unprecedented situation develops. WWE is clearly facing a dilemma as a lot of their superstars and staff need to fly home to see their families, and whilst WWE figured out a solution to the fact that some places aren't taking people coming from Florida, it's now created a bigger mess. New Jersey, Connecticut, and New York have all said anyone coming from Florida needs to face a 2-week quarantine. And given that the WWE can't wait 2 weeks, they're now sending their staff to Philadelphia, and the employee has to figure out how to get to their own destinations from there. One anonymous longtime WWE staff member ironically pointed out that this is how a publicly traded company is operating, and described everyone and everything as a complete mess. It was reported that the WWE didn't do proper tests until a developmental wrestler in the Performance Center tested positive, and that after the company tested every superstar, staff member, and executive, several positive tests were discovered. Recently, WWE planned to record 2 weeks of television for Raw and SmackDown, but that didn't work out, as with tests not arriving back in time, the situation was described as a mess by those backstage. With all these worries about safety, it's been reported that some in WWE are trying to establish a biodome, which would allow WWE to have greater control over the environment they're putting their staff in. When one anonymous longtime WWE employee was asked about whether WWE should invest in a biodome, they didn't mince their words, saying, "No shit, that would be great, I wish they would do that." Whilst a biodome doesn't have to be a physical dome, it would allow WWE to eliminate travel, remove fans, and establish measures that would make sure that superstars and staff could operate in a safe environment, all while under the advice of doctors. Some biodomes even allow people and their families to live in them, and although WWE hasn't hinted at constructing one yet, the fact that Vince McMahon's net worth grew 10% over the past 3 months means the boss certainly has the bank to make it happen. Over to AEW now, and Hangman Page recently returned to Twitter after a brief absence. On Twitter, Page joked that the reason he deleted his account was he forgot his password, though it should be noted that Page deleted his account during the claims of wrongdoing made at several wrestlers. Whilst Page didn't receive any claims, many people he knew did, including Marty Scurll, Jimmy Havoc, Sammy Guevara, and Joey Ryan. Hopefully this break from the social media site did Page some good, and we advise him to write his password down in a secure location next time. Back to WWE, and it's no secret that Monday Night Raw has undergone a lot of changes following Paul Heyman's removal as executive director, and now another shift has come to light. Following Heyman's dismissal, it was reported that Andrade and Angel Garza were favorites of the ECW magnate, and according to Meltzer, the duo should have already reached the top of the Red Brand's tag team division. He said, "Andrade and Angel Garza are being groomed. Obviously, they're going for a tag team title match against the Street Profits. I don't know if they're going to win it, at one point they were, but they're being groomed for sure." Before Heyman's firing, Andrade, Garza, and Zelina Vega were positioned to be a top-tier stable on Raw, whilst they're now in a place lower down the card. This doesn't automatically mean they won't be used now that Heyman isn't around to vouch for them, but time will tell what becomes of the former United States Champion and his tag team partner, with Bruce Pritchard running both of WWE's main roster shows. Over to Impact next, and after the release of the World Champion Tessa Blanchard, the Slammiversary main event must now be changed. Whilst the majority of those involved in the Fatal 4-Way will stay the same, Blanchard is being replaced by a mystery opponent who will take on Ace Austin, Eddie Edwards, and Trey Miguel. Michael Elgin was originally booked for the match, but has since been suspended, and the company reportedly also plans on adding a match for the Impact Tag titles, which will see the North facing Sami Callihan and Ken Shamrock. Slammiversary 2020 is clearly not the show the company had planned just a few weeks ago, but with all released WWE superstars out of their non-compete clause by the day of the show, Slammiversary could have some huge surprises. Speaking of returns to Impact, the company has been teasing several big names who were released, and this continued this week. On the show, Scott D'Amore said he was speaking on the phone to what he described as a couple of good brothers, a nickname for Luke Gallows and Carl Anderson, who have reportedly already signed with the company, though that hasn't been confirmed by Impact or the former Raw Tag Team Champions. That wasn't the only tease, as earlier in the night, footage was shown of Eric Young's TNA Championship win over Magnus, and by the end of the night, fans saw the classic Super Eric costume, hinting that he too will be returning at Slammiversary. Whilst it seems that EY could return under the Super Eric gimmick, older fans will remember him being in Team Canada alongside Scott D'Amore. These teases come after EC3's music was recently played on a past episode, and we'll just have to wait until July 18th to see who does show up at Slammiversary. We're sticking with Impact Wrestling next, as another former WWE superstar has teased joining the company this month. Fans will recall that Heath Slater was released from WWE after over a decade on April 15th. This week, the one-man Southern rock band posted a video of himself training on an exercise bike. The most interesting part of the short video is the message, July 18th, coming soon, which just so happens to be the date of Impact's Slammiversary pay-per-view, as well as mere days after his non-compete contract with WWE expires. Slater's former tag team partner Rhino has also gotten involved in this, as he said on Impact that his future tag partner in the company has got kids, a reference to Slater's catchphrase in WWE. Impact themselves have been teasing plenty of WWE stars for their pay-per-view, as a recent advert for Slammiversary hinted at EC3, Eric Young, Kurt Angle, and many other recent releases. Time will tell whether the inaugural SmackDown Tag Team Champion will join Rhino in Impact, but Slater certainly looks to be in phenomenal shape despite his recent release. Back to WWE now, and after it was reported that Velveteen Dream was in a car accident, more details have emerged on what happened. According to Wrestling Inc., the former NXT North American champion failed to stop at a red light and hit another car around 4 p.m. Eastern on Friday, and Dream was hospitalized but later released. The driver of the other vehicle also sustained some injuries, but it's not currently known just how bad they were. 2020 hasn't been a great year for Dream, who faced claims of sending explicit photos to minors earlier this year, and given that he's not been on TV since the recent movement to remove predatory individuals from wrestling, it'll be interesting to see what kind of future the 24-year-old has in WWE. Back to Impact now, as the company is being sued by its own founder and WWE Hall of Famer Jeff Jarrett. This lawsuit is over claims that Impact owes Double J money, and now the two parties have met in the courtroom in Nashville. Whilst this lawsuit is about Impact Wrestling, it's actually targeted at Anthem, Impact's parent company. Jarrett has complained about Anthem using 16 one-hour episodes of Global Force Wrestling that he produced, and that the master tapes that Jarrett is after have already been deleted by the company. In the past, Jarrett has claimed that each hour of lost GFW programming is worth $300,000 each, meaning that Anthem deleted supposedly $4.8 million worth in content. This is a big figure for Jarrett to claim his show was worth, but it's worth taking with a grain of salt, as WWE didn't pay close to that for the entirety of WCW and its video library. Due to legal restrictions, we can't reveal much more about the case, but it's been reported that jurors were selected on Monday in a process that took 3 hours to complete. The trial is expected to last around a week, and it'll be interesting to see how the former WCW World Heavyweight Champion works in the courtroom. And finally, we've got an update from Renee Young, as she recently teased a big fat announcement on Twitter. Now Young has given an update as to what her announcement will be, as she took to social media to say she sent a very important email and seemed very happy to do so. Young's announcement is set to be made today, and whilst we don't know what the beloved Canadian has to say, Young has already denied she's pregnant, so fans shouldn't expect a mini Moxley, at least not yet.